Day number 1, Mr. Fedeli.
I move that whereas the 2016 Ontario budget is soon to be introduced in the legislature, whereas hydro bills have continued to skyrocket across the province, making it harder for seniors and families to get by, whereas the cost of the Liberal government's scandals, waste and mismanagement is taking away funding for essential services, whereas the Liberal government's cuts to frontline health care means Ontario patients are being denied the quality health care they deserve, and whereas the Liberal government has no credible plan to balance the budget, the Legislative Assembly of Ontario calls on the Liberal government to include the following in the 2016 Ontario budget. 1. A credible plan to make energy affordable, which shall include halting any further sale of shares in Hydro One. 2. A plan to properly manage Ontario's health care system, which shall include reversing the current and planned cuts to doctors, nurses and hospitals, and a credible plan to balance the budget and take immediate action to pay down the debt.
Mr. Fedeli has moved Opposition Day number 1. Mr. Fedeli.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I want to take some time to address each of our requests in detail and talk about the concerns we heard during the pre-budget consultations. Now, Speaker, I start off by talking about the pre-budget consultations because all three parties, at some expense to the taxpayer, toured 5 cities outside of Toronto and then spent 2 days here in Toronto. We spent time, Speaker, in Hamilton, Windsor, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Ottawa, and then back here in Toronto, listening to the people of Ontario. All the while, Speaker, the budget was being written, translated, and printed without any input from the very people throughout the province that were going out of their way to come to these various hearings and tell us their stories. Speaker, it was very, very disheartening to see that the budget is being delivered tomorrow as opposed to the traditional time after the federal budget and sometime in late March or April. So they've rushed this budget and sadly did not listen to any of the people of Ontario. So let me tell a story, Speaker, on the hydro, where we're talking about a credible plan to make energy affordable, which shall include halting any further sale of the shares of hydro. 2 days ago, I got a text and then a follow-up phone call with a friend of mine in Trout Creek, actually Trout Creek, Ontario, is the south end of my riding. His name is Steve Siglin, and he runs a little shop in behind his house called Siggy's Woodworking. And I like to visit there. It's a lot of fun. He's got a wonderful wife, Cheryl, 2 great kids, Braxton and Jayla. It's a lot of fun going there. If anybody likes to tinker with woodworking, he's got a great little shop, a couple of employees. And he texted me and said, Vic, my hydro bill this month is $904.23. Now, if that's not bad enough, Speaker, if that doesn't make your eyes roll, he was closed for a week, and then his power was shut off, as was mine at home, for 5 days. So you've got 12 days without power. So we're talking, just a little over half a month, and his bill was $904.23. Speaker, he said to me, Vic, what am I going to do? This is quite a bit higher. And I said, Steve, we talked before. I told you that, these guys were going to put your hydro bill up on January 1 and take your 10% away. And that, of course, is indeed what happened. But it was just a shock. And we heard that a lot from people in our constituency offices. And I'm pretty sure the government is getting the same phone calls we're getting. They don't really seem to talk about those, Speaker, but Steve Siglin said to me, Vic, I wanted to hire another guy in my shop, but I don't think I can. In fact, I talked to him today when I asked for his permission to share the story and the amount of his power bill, and he said, no, I've decided I can't hire that extra guy. I just can't. And we talked about the fact that we have the highest hydro rates in North America. But then he got on the other topics as well. I mean, he's just a small business guy, a couple of employees, and we talked about the upcoming pension plan as well. And he talked about the fact that with all of these extra costs, he just cannot see how he can expand. But it's the hydro bill that is just the clincher. Put him over the end. So somebody today doesn't have a job over that hydro bill that he received. Speaker, our rates have quadrupled. Our hydro rates have quadrupled since 2003. Business groups continue to complain we're uncompetitive. The Chamber of Commerce, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, in their latest report, I mean, Speaker, when you see us confidence in business tumbling from 47% down to 30% and lower, I mean, this has got to be a wake-up call to the government that something is wrong, that something is terribly wrong. When you've got the president and CEO, Sergio Marchionne, from Fiat, Chrysler, saying, Ontario, you've become too high a cost jurisdiction to do business. These are the messages. I can tell you an example in my hometown, Arkland. Now, when I was a young kid, this is a company that's been there almost 60 years, Speaker, was the Wright Coal plant. It was a Wright Coal Chemical. Everybody knew it. It was several city blocks, hundreds of employees, always there. It's just been a fixture in North Bay. Well, today, the lights are gone. The lights are off. There's nothing there, Speaker, just this empty shell of a company, no employees. They pulled out of North Bay, and the front page of the North Bay Nugget was a story that they pulled out because of hydro rates. Speaker, they said that this plant in North Bay was the most expensive hydro of all of their 13 plants in North America. Plain and simple. When I traveled with MPP Rick Nichols to his riding, we toured a greenhouse. It was a couple years ago now. And we toured this greenhouse, and the owner was telling us the fact that he wanted to double the size of his facility, add 100 people, and spend countless dollars building a twin greenhouse. So we ran into him here at Queen's Park at one of the receptions just before the winter break. And I said to him, Peter, how did the expansion go? Did you ever build that greenhouse and add those 100 employees? He said, Vic, I want you to know, I did indeed build that greenhouse. I spent $100 million building the greenhouse and hired 100 people, except I built it in Ohio. He told us he went to Ohio because he could not afford the energy rates here in Ontario. And then he told me of his pal who did the same thing as he did, except he opened in Pennsylvania. They both have cheap power, and Speaker, a lot of that power comes from the province of Ontario that we pay the states in Quebec every single night to take from us. So, Speaker, these are real stories from real people, real corporations who have either left Ontario, expanded out of Ontario, not hiring people, all because we have the highest hydro rates in North America. So again, our first ask, we ask this government for a credible plan to make energy affordable, and that includes halting any further sale of the shares of Hydro One. Yeah. Speaker, our second ask, we heard the same thing as we traveled Ontario on these pre-budget consultations, and so we asked this government for a plan to properly manage Ontario's healthcare system, which shall include reversing the current and planned cuts to doctors, nurses, and hospitals. So, Speaker, let me give you an example. You hear about cuts to hospitals, not doctors and nurses for a moment. We'll get to that in a second, but hospitals. When they say, we're cutting hospital beds. Well, I often wondered, well, what does that mean? What does that technically mean? What does that actually mean? So my wife Patty and I were visiting friends of ours, Jan and Joe. One of them was in the hospital, and we were visiting, and they said, have a look in the room. They were in a double room. Have a look in the room next door. So I slid the curtain open and looked, and it was vacant, just absolutely empty. The bed was gone, the little table was gone, the phone was gone, the TV was gone, just the electronics that are built into the wall. That's all that was left there. And you have to realize what the heck that means. So I asked one of the nurses on duty, and she said, yep, when they say they're closing a bed, they actually take the bed, fold it up, put it downstairs, cover it in plastic. They closed 60 beds in the hospital in my city of North Bay. Speaker, when I was mayor of North Bay only a few years ago, I was there for the ribbon cutting of this brand new multi-hundred gajillion dollar hospital, and now here we are, we're closed, 60 beds are gone. And Speaker, shameful. Today there are 350 fewer employees in that hospital than there were only a couple years ago. Just this past year, only months ago, they let 158 people go. Cuts to frontline health care. This is what's happening when you cannot balance the budget, when you have these wild deficits, when you have waste, mismanagement, and scandal. You know, people say, Vic, where are you guys going to find the money to do all these things then? Well, I refer back to that. You stop the waste, you begin to manage properly with the assets that you have and the resources you have, and you don't get involved in these scandals. You know, $1 billion. You can find $1 billion to close a gas plant, but you can't find money to keep 60 hospital beds open in a brand new hospital. You can't find money for those 350 men and women who you fired. You can't find that, but you can find $410 million to bail out a U.S. owner of the Mars building across the street. Now, don't get me wrong. The Mars people do wonderful work. I'm talking about the realtor who owns the building. You know, we found out only through the little brown envelope that was slid under the door during the election that this government secretly paid $410 million to bail out a U.S.-owned company. They can find that $410 million without telling anybody, but you can't find money for the 100 nurses that you fired in North Bay, let alone the hundreds, everybody here on this side. Everybody has a story that they'll tell you. The other side has those stories too. They don't want to tell you about them. So, Speaker, this is what happens. The Auditor General warned us that this was going to happen. 2014, in her report to us, she talked about the crowding out of services, that if you continue to spend and grow these deficits and add to the debt, which was then, of course, as now, approaching $300 billion, you are going to, in her words, crowd out the very services that men and women in the province of Ontario, families, seniors and kids, all require. Nothing. Crickets. Nothing happened over there. A full year. The Auditor General, just this December, in her latest report, almost took word for word her 2014 report and repeated it. She repeated it because nobody here on the government side, on the Liberal side, did anything about it. So she said, I'm going to tell you the same thing again this year, and maybe now you'll do something about it. So in the meantime, this crowding out has become real. We had diabetes testing strips that are cut. We have physiotherapy for seniors, gone, cut from 100 sessions a year to 4. Speaker, we have cataract surgeries, gone, cut. These are real cuts that affect real people every single day, Speaker, because, as the Auditor General told us, you're crowding out the services that we need. It has to stop, Speaker, and that's why we're asking in our motion today for a plan to properly manage the health care system. The resources are there, Speaker. They're just frittering them away on waste, mismanagement, and scandal. Speaker, our third ask, we're talking about a credible, and I have to underline, if there was such a way to visually underline the word credible, plan to balance the budget and take immediate action to pay down the debt. Now, before I got back down here this afternoon, I was telling a friend that I'm going to be talking about this, and he said to me, and I wrote this down, debt is like body weight. It's the easiest thing to increase and the hardest to decrease. Speaker, he hit the nail on the head. I can attest to that. But it is no joke, right? It's so easy. Wave the magic wand, pixie dust, throw it out. We'll do that. You want that? We'll give you that. You want that? Let's have it. But somebody's got to pay these bills, Speaker, and our bills are massive. We are going to hit $300 billion in debt. Speaker, $300 billion. We are, the province of Ontario is the largest subnational debtor in the world. That's what we're number one in, Speaker. You know, to the member from Parry Sound Muskoka, I say we used to be number one in mining, the number one mining jurisdiction in the world. Today, we're 23rd, is it? We've fallen to 23rd, but we are the number one largest sub-debtor nation in the world. This is what has happened to us, Speaker. So now the government will continue to claim that they're going to balance the budget, but all we've seen, Speaker, is red ink. Every single year, deficit, deficit, deficit. We're going to see another deficit tomorrow. Oh, look, they're going to tell us, look, the deficit's coming down. But we learned how that deficit was reduced. In the fall economic statement, they had to come clean, Speaker. We saw, page 99, page 100, we saw that the sale of Hydro 1, that money went right into general revenue, Speaker. We saw that. That's very clear. They've been outed. We now know. If you look at page 106 and 107 of the fall economic statement, it alludes to the fact that the cap and trade monies, $300 million this year, $1.3 billion next year, are all going right into general revenue as well. This is exactly. Let me just talk very briefly about the shell game that they play, where they'll say, no, this money's for transit and infrastructure. Well, technically, very technically, they're correct, Speaker. They're going to put that money into transit and infrastructure. However, what the fall economic statement showed us, and with their Bill 144, their Budget Bill 144, the finance bill, I should say, that came out, they will now have a mechanism to take the money that was already in the infrastructure budget, take that out and put it against the deficit. So it's all buzzwords. The bottom line, Speaker, the $130 billion in infrastructure was there in 2014, was there in 2015, never needed the sale of Hydro to make that except last year, and so it's always selling something to make up the difference. So, Speaker, you wonder why the people of Ontario don't believe this government anymore. If you remember, a couple of years ago, when they talked about they had a path to balance. Well, Speaker, we know there was no path to balance. Their own documents that we revealed from the gas plant scandal proved there was no path to balance. They had a multi-billion-dollar hole in their budget, and the Financial Accountability Officer confirmed what was in those documents just this fall. So I want to read, Speaker, just briefly, a little bit of information that we saw from the Financial Accountability Officer. It's technical, Speaker, I'll give you that, but when you have a debt of $300 billion and a deficit that is spewing red ink every year for a decade, it's important that we acknowledge this. The government told us that they're going to balance by 2017-18. The Financial Accountability Officer said, well, look, you have spending planned at 4.3% of growth. We're not going to make that. So you should reduce that number to 3%. That's a fair number to use in your growth. And if you do that, you should drop your revenue by about $1 billion. Well, the government listened to half of them. They did drop the number from 4.3 to 2.9, even a little better than the Financial Accountability Officer said. So we're going to have less revenue, is what that tells us. But instead of taking the rest of the Financial Accountability Officer's story, he said, so if you're claiming less revenue, you should lower it by $1 billion. Well, instead, they raised it by $1 billion. So how can you possibly tell the world we're not going to have 4.3% growth, we're not going to have $124 billion in revenue, our growth is only going to be 2.9%, and somehow magically that jumps up to $125 billion in revenue. Somehow their math clearly is not good. So we'll be looking very closely at the budget tomorrow, Speaker, to see, well, how do you get less growth and more revenue? We'll be very excited to see how they come to that number, Speaker, because that's voodoo math, that's the Liberal math, we know that now. And we know that because the finance minister yesterday and the day before called our asks fantasy. He said, your 3 budget asks are a fantasy. So, Speaker, somehow now asking for affordable hydro for Steve Sigland and his wife and kids, somehow asking for affordable hydro for them, well, that's a fantasy. Somehow asking to restore the cuts, the 60 beds that were closed in my hospital and many others, somehow that's a fantasy. These people are so out of touch with reality, with real people, with real stories, Speaker. Stories I've talked about in this legislature, and they all heard. Families who are feeling the pain. Seniors who are going hungry because their caregiver hasn't got the time in the home to give them a meal. That was a real story we heard. Somebody who fell down out of weakness on their front steps because they were released from a hospital too soon. That's a real story we heard. Speaker, those are real stories from real people, and that's why we're asking for our 3 recommendations to be acknowledged by this government and that they take our recommendations and implement them. I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, Speaker.